You arrive at Uxmal's pyramid just as the late afternoon light begins to soften, brushing golden hues across the weathered stone. Shadows stretch long over the cracked terraces, curling into the crevices and hinting at the silent histories embedded in the walls. A faint wind moves across the plaza, carrying the scent of damp earth and moss, and you notice how it flutters through narrow gaps between stones, almost like a secret breath exhaled from the past. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. Your footsteps make no sound. You glide over the uneven ground, invisible, unnoticed, a silent observer of the forgotten civilization. The pyramid looms ahead, its steep terraces rising with a deliberate geometry that seems impossibly precise for a people whose tools were simple by modern standards. Researchers still argue that the level of architectural sophistication here suggests knowledge lost to time, a wisdom deliberately obscured by history itself. Your gaze is drawn upward to the topmost terrace. A faint light flickers from a distant arch, though there is no torch, no obvious source. You wonder if it's the sun catching a polished stone, or perhaps a glimmer of something else, something the pyramid has been hiding all along. The smell of sun-warmed stone mixes with the moist aroma of moss, and you can almost hear a low, resonant hum when you press your ear to the wall, as if the structure itself is breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. The stairs ahead are jagged, worn smooth in patches by centuries of use. Each step is uneven, a subtle reminder that time here moves differently. As you ascend, small pieces of stone crumble underfoot, not from your weight, of course, but as if the pyramid senses an intruder in its space and sighs quietly. A breeze stirs in your hair, carrying a whisper of voices you cannot identify, fleeting and indistinct, like echoes from another century. From this vantage point, you notice the plaza below, scattered with moss-covered pillars, some toppled, others leaning at impossible angles. There's a sense of deliberate chaos, an order hidden beneath apparent randomness. You glide closer to a pillar, with faint carvings, tracing patterns in your mind as if your invisible fingertips could read the stories etched into the stone. Tiny chips fall silently, landing on cracked tiles below, and the faint smell of dust rises in gentle spirals. Researchers still argue that Uxmal's builders encoded astronomical knowledge within the pyramid itself. Yet you feel there's more here, a story not written in stone or sky. The breeze stirs again, lifting small leaves and twigs across your path, and you notice a subtle shimmer of light reflecting off a corner where a stone seems unnaturally smooth. Could it be a sealed doorway? You cannot yet tell, but curiosity tightens gently around your senses. Before we step further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you feel like joining me on nights like this. You pause, pretending for a moment that your audience is with you, and imagine them leaving tiny marks of presence in the shadows, comments noting their location and local time, as though connecting across centuries of forgotten history. The thought brings a faint smile. You imagine the pyramid listening, counting these tiny disturbances like echoes in a long, deep chamber. The air feels cooler here, a contrast to the warmth of sunlit terraces, and you notice that shadows gather in unexpected places, creeping around corners and pooling beneath carved reliefs. A small lizard, scurries across a stone, startled by nothing, and you almost chuckle at its audacity. If it knew how invisible you were, surely it would still pause, puzzled by your unseen presence. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stone underfoot radiates history, each crack a whisper, each edge softened by centuries of wind and rain. You step closer to the pyramid itself, glancing upward at the first terrace. There, partially hidden in shadow, is the faint outline of something unusual, a narrow slit, or perhaps a deliberately sealed doorway. You wonder who might have entered long ago, who left this mark on history, and what secrets still hide behind that stone veil. The moss feels almost alive, brushing against invisible fingers, and the smell of damp earth mixes with faint pollen drifting from unseen flowers in the plaza below. The soft creak of a distant wooden beam, abandoned centuries ago, resonates somewhere deep inside the pyramid, adding a subtle rhythm to the quiet of the place. You feel your senses sharpen, attuned to every detail, the way shadows tilt with the sun, the faint hint of incense in the air, the almost imperceptible hum of the pyramid itself. Above, the top terraces glimmer faintly in the evening sun. You notice cracks in the stone, worn edges, and weathered carvings that once told stories of rulers, gods, and perhaps forgotten rituals. You hover near a particularly intricate carving depicting a jaguar, its mouth frozen in a silent roar, moss creeping across its limbs like the slow hands of time. Researchers still argue whether the jaguar represented a deity or a symbol of power. Yet here, in this moment, it seems to watch you as much as you watch it. A gentle gust stirs the plaza, lifting dust and tiny pebbles, and you notice the delicate play of light across the terraces. The shadow of the pyramid stretches long, merging with the surrounding landscape, and for a moment you feel the pull of time blur, as if centuries are folding over themselves. You wonder why this place has remained so enigmatic, why history has allowed only whispers to survive instead of full accounts. There, tucked in a corner where the stone meets the earth, is a faint glimmer of something polished, catching the last rays of sun, a sealed doorway, or perhaps just the reflection of a smooth stone. You cannot tell yet, but the sense of anticipation coils lightly in your chest. The pyramid has many eyes, and one of them seems to watch, silent and patient. As shadows deepen and the wind carries faint echoes across terraces, you take a slow breath, feeling the ancient air press gently against your invisible presence. Each step forward is a step deeper into mystery, each glance revealing textures and shapes that hint at stories almost forgotten. The moss, the cracked stones, the subtle flicker of light, they all beckon, promising secrets to those patient enough to notice. Your invisible journey has only begun, and yet already you feel the weight and wonder of Uxmal's pyramid pressing gently against your senses. You pause for a heartbeat, letting your awareness expand across terraces, columns, and plazas, savoring the stillness, the ancient whispers, and the soft thrill of unknown history waiting to be revealed. You drift down from the pyramid terraces into the plaza below, where worn stone pavements stretch in irregular patterns, sun-bleached and dusted with moss. Shadows gather along the edges of low walls and toppled columns, curling like curious fingers, reaching for the secrets beneath. A faint echo of wind whistles through narrow passageways, carrying with it the scent of warm stone and the faint metallic tang of centuries-old rainwater trapped in crevices. You notice how the light shifts subtly across the bas reliefs carved into the surrounding walls, animating the jaguar heads, serpents, and geometric patterns as if they were moving, breathing in time with the earth itself. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke, and you almost wish they did. The plaza feels vast yet intimate, a paradox that settles over you, like the hush before sleep. Tiny fissures in the stone reveal hidden layers beneath, where earlier builders' marks linger faintly, nearly erased, but refusing to vanish entirely. Researchers still argue that these carvings were more than decorative. Some suggest they mapped celestial alignments or encoded the memory of forgotten rulers. You step closer to a low wall, trailing your invisible fingers over the rough, sun-warmed stone. The texture is uneven, granular, and for a fleeting moment, you imagine it whispering beneath your touch. A sudden flicker of movement catches your eye. A shadow, elongated and serpentine, slides along the base of a column. There is no wind strong enough to cause it, and yet it shifts as though alive, a playful echo of the plaza's original inhabitants. You pause and tilt your head, letting the light settle again. The bas reliefs seem to ripple subtly in the golden glow, the carvings of feathered serpents curving into themselves, mouths frozen mid-roar, eyes glinting with something almost mischievous. You wonder if these figures were meant to guard something, a hidden doorway or long-buried relic, a secret that Uxmal never fully surrendered. Nearby, a partially toppled column bears a peculiar mark, a shallow groove running diagonally across its face. It catches the light differently than the rest of the stone, reflecting faint glimmers that might be mere chance or something deliberate. Researchers still argue that Uxmal's architects employed advanced knowledge of stone placement and light reflection, possibly for ceremonial purposes. Yet the true meaning has never been confirmed. You drift closer, imagining the ceremonies that might have taken place here. Priests moving through shafts of golden sunlight, the air thick with incense and expectation. The plaza opens up to a series of low terraces, each edged with ornate stone balustrades. Small tufts of grass sprout in the cracks, softening the sharpness of the carved edges. You glide along one of these terraces, noticing a carved jaguar paw barely visible beneath centuries of lichen. The detail is exquisite, almost alive, as though the stone itself remembers the rhythm of its maker's hand. Shadows twist across the terraces as the sun shifts westward, giving the illusion that the carvings themselves are shifting, interacting with the fading light. A faint sound reaches your ears, a whisper of wind through a hollow space, the soft rustle of leaves from distant trees brushing against stone. It carries with it the strange sensation of time folding back on itself, moments from centuries ago brushing the present as if urging you to notice. You glide toward a shallow recess in the plaza wall where faded glyphs, almost completely eroded, hint at forgotten names, titles, or perhaps prayers. You wonder what secret still hides within these carved lines, what stories the original people intended to preserve, and what was deliberately erased. Above, the pyramid terraces cast elongated shadows across the plaza, merging with the silhouettes of toppled pillars to form abstract patterns that almost resemble ancient constellations. Time seems to blur here. A moment stretches into an eternity, and yet movement continues. Subtle, unhurried, deliberate. You drift closer to a circular stone basin filled with rainwater that has collected over recent days. The water is dark and still, reflecting fragments of carvings and arches in a distorted mosaic. The surface ripples lightly as the wind stirs, and you notice the reflection of something else. A faint glimmer, perhaps a hint of a doorway that doesn't exist from this angle. Researchers still argue that water played a central role in Uxmal's architecture, not merely for practical purposes, but also symbolic ones, perhaps representing life, death, or the journey between worlds. You run your invisible fingers along the rim of the basin, feeling the smooth, worn edges of stone, imagining the ceremonies that might have taken place here. Tiny particles of dust drift lazily in the air, illuminated by slanted rays of sunlight, giving the plaza a soft, almost magical glow. A sudden, playful thought crosses your mind. You imagine one of the jaguar carvings blinking, rolling its eyes in gentle mischief at your invisible presence. You smile quietly, sensing the pyramid's humor, subtle and patient. The bas-reliefs, now bathed in shifting shadows, seem to wink at you, the stone alive with stories, laughter, and perhaps gentle admonishments for those who tread too hastily. As the afternoon wanes, you notice a narrow corridor tucked between two terraces. Its opening is partially obscured by a toppled column and creeping moss, but the air around it feels different, cooler, slightly damp, carrying a faint, earthy aroma. You step closer, drawn by curiosity, imagining the hidden passages that might wind below the plaza. The shadows deepen, and the flicker of sunlight through openings in the pyramid walls paints patterns that move slowly like living creatures. You pause for a moment, letting the plaza's quiet seep into your awareness. The wind whispers against stone, carrying scents of moss, earth, and perhaps the faint trace of incense from ceremonies long past. Tiny cracks in the paving stones give off a faint metallic tang, as if the earth itself is reminding you that history is not only preserved, but sometimes deliberately hidden. You wonder why these details were left behind and why others were erased, leaving only partial whispers of civilization. A distant sound reaches your ears, subtle, almost imperceptible. Perhaps it is water dripping from the terrace above, or a faint stone settling into its ancient place. Time seems to stretch and blur again, minutes melting into centuries, as you drift silently along the plaza, observing without disturbing, noting patterns, shapes, and stories embedded in every worn edge and shadowed nook. The sun dips lower, painting the plaza in warmer golds and cooler blues. Shadows lengthen, merging with the intricate bas-reliefs and toppled columns. You sense a gentle invitation, an urge to follow the corridor deeper, to uncover what has remained hidden here for generations. There is no rush. You glide, patient and attentive, allowing every texture, every scent, every subtle whisper of the plaza to seep into your consciousness. A moss-covered pillar catches your attention, its surface worn but intricately carved, a silent testament to a civilization both remembered and forgotten. Tiny flickers of light dance across its surface, suggesting more than mere ornamentation, a message, a memory, or perhaps a playful trick left by the builders for those curious enough to look closely. You hover near it, savoring the quiet rhythm of wind, shadows, and memory. Researchers still argue that every element in Uxmal's plaza had multiple purposes, blending practical, ceremonial, and symbolic meanings in ways that remain partly inscrutable. You note the cracked edges of paving stones, the subtle inclines, and the alignment of shadows. You wonder what ceremonies once unfolded here, what conversations echoed across terraces, and which secrets were deliberately hidden or erased. The plaza exhales, carrying the faint scent of moss and sun-warmed stone, and you feel the soft pull of anticipation as the corridor ahead beckons. You drift toward it, glancing once more at the gently rippling basin, the subtle curves of fallen columns, and the elongated shadows merging in soft patterns. The plaza holds its breath, and so do you, ready to step into the unknown pathways that might lead to forgotten chambers, hidden carvings, or the mysteries that continue to whisper beneath Uxmal's watchful stones. You approach the stairway leading up the pyramid's steep terraces, each step worn smooth by centuries of footfalls, yet uneven enough to remind you of the passage of time. Shadows gather in the crevices, twisting and lengthening as the sun tilts lower, and a faint breeze carries the earthy scent of moss and sun-warmed stone. Your invisible presence moves silently, gliding over the cracked edges, feeling the texture in a way that only someone unseen might. The stairway seems to rise endlessly, the terraces stacked like layered memories, each holding fragments of ceremonies, whispers, and forgotten laughter. You wouldn't believe the stories these steps could tell if they spoke. At the first landing, you notice a partial relief hidden in the shadow of a nearby balustrade. The carving depicts a figure with jaguar-like features, crouching as if ready to pounce, eyes frozen in stone. Researchers still argue whether such imagery was symbolic of spiritual guardianship or literal depictions of revered beings. You step closer, the faint sound of wind whispering through the terraces, brushing against your senses, and trace the outline of the carving in your mind. The grooves are worn, but a faint glimmer hints that this figure might have been polished intentionally, catching sunlight during specific times of the year. The stairway narrows, and you notice the walls along the ascent are subtly angled, designed to focus light and shadow in precise ways. A gentle flicker catches your attention, sunlight bouncing off a smooth stone, creating a small, shifting patch of brightness that dances across the carved figures. You wonder why the builders invested such care in these hidden details. Was it ritual, astronomy, or perhaps a playful secret left for those curious enough to notice? The breeze carries a faint rustle of leaves from a nearby courtyard, a whisper of life returning to forgotten spaces. As you continue upward, the stairs grow steeper, and the texture of the stone changes beneath your invisible presence. Cooler, slightly damp in the shaded areas, warm where sunlight strikes. Tiny cracks reveal traces of earlier construction phases, subtle lines that hint at builders' experiments in shape and alignment. Researchers still argue that those terraces were constructed with astronomical alignments in mind, perhaps mapping solstices or the paths of distant stars. You wonder what secrets were lost when those alignments faded over centuries of erosion and shifting ground. Near the midsection of the stairway, a narrow slit in the wall catches your attention, a possible entrance partially obscured by a crumbling stone. You lean closer, and a faint scent of damp earth and moss rises from the gap. Could this be a sealed doorway, a hidden chamber long forgotten? The light inside is too faint to discern any details, yet you feel a subtle pull, a curiosity that tightens gently around your senses. Shadows from the surrounding terraces creep into the slit, flickering like watchful eyes. Higher up, the stairway opens onto a small landing with a low wall, covered in carved motifs of serpents and celestial symbols. The carvings are faint, eroded by time, yet they maintain a rhythm, a sense of intentional design that is mesmerizing. You glide along the wall, brushing past moss and feeling the granular texture of stone softened by centuries of wind and rain. The light shifts subtly, highlighting one particular motif, a serpent curling into itself, almost as if guarding an invisible doorway. Researchers still argue whether such patterns were decorative, symbolic, or functional, guiding light and shadow during ceremonies. A soft, distant sound reaches your ears, a gentle creak, as if the stones themselves are settling into place after centuries. You tilt your head, listening, and the sensation of time blurs. Moments feel stretched, as though the pyramid itself is breathing slowly, deliberately. Tiny flecks of dust drift lazily through the sunlit air, illuminated like sparkling motes in a dream. You imagine the builders walking these same steps centuries ago, unaware that you, an invisible observer, are tracing their paths in silence. At the next landing, you encounter a small niche carved into the wall, partially obscured by a leaning pillar. Inside is the faint outline of a small idol, its features cracked, but still discernible, a human figure with feline attributes, arms extended in a gesture you cannot fully decipher. You wonder what role this figure played, what rituals or offerings it might have witnessed, and whether it was ever truly alive in the eyes of its creators. The moss brushing against its base is soft, almost tactile, carrying the scent of earth and time. The stairway continues upward, narrowing once more. Your invisible presence allows you to glide effortlessly, noticing details that might escape any ordinary observer. Faint inscriptions nearly erased by centuries of wind, tiny chips that hint at the original carving process, and subtle variations in stone that create shifting patterns of light and shadow. Researchers still argue about the meanings of these inscriptions, whether they were ceremonial records, warnings, or messages intended to be deliberately obscure. You wonder which secrets were intentionally left hidden and which simply faded into obscurity. Near the top, the terraces expand slightly, creating a platform with a partial view of the surrounding landscape. The plaza below stretches out like a miniature model, moss-covered columns and toppled stones forming a delicate pattern in the fading sunlight. A gentle wind lifts small leaves and particles of dust, sending them floating across the stone like tiny messengers from the past. You pause, noticing the faint glimmer of a smooth surface at the corner of the platform. A possible doorway, polished and worn, catching the last rays of sun. The pyramid's architecture seems to direct your gaze, guiding you toward what it has kept hidden. As the sun dips lower, shadows deepen, casting dramatic angles across the stairway. The interplay of light and dark animates the carvings, creating fleeting moments where serpents and jaguars seem to slither and prowl in the fading glow. You almost laugh softly at the illusion, imagining a gentle chase across terraces that no one has traversed in centuries. The sensation of time folding over itself continues. One step upward feels like moving both forward and backward, a paradox that tightens the mystery surrounding the pyramid. Finally, you reach the top landing. Here, the stairway ends at a low archway, partially blocked by a fallen stone. Sunlight flickers across its surface, revealing faint carvings, serpents, celestial symbols, and perhaps the remnants of a door once sealed. A slight draft rises from behind the archway, carrying the earthy scent of an underground space. Could it be a forgotten chamber? You glide closer, heart quietly thrumming in invisible anticipation, aware that this is just one layer of secrets within Uxmal's mysterious pyramid. The top terrace is bathed in a soft, golden glow as the sun begins its descent. Shadows stretch across carvings, terraces, and toppled pillars, merging into an intricate mosaic of light and dark. You pause, absorbing the textures, smells, and subtle hum of the pyramid, feeling the pull of anticipation as you prepare to explore what lies beyond the sealed doorway. Every step, every detail, every flicker of light seems designed to guide you gently, yet insistently, toward mysteries that have waited patiently for centuries. You glide along the top landing, drawn toward the low archway that marks the end of the stairway. The stone beneath your invisible feet feels cool and slightly uneven, worn smooth in some places, but jagged in others. Moss has crept into the cracks, softening the edges and giving the impression that nature itself is reclaiming the pyramid, one terrace at a time. A faint breeze slips through the archway, carrying the damp, earthy scent of an interior space long untouched by human hands. Shadows ripple across the walls, stretching and contracting with the shifting sunlight, and you notice how the carvings in the stone seem to pulse ever so slightly, as if alive. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. Peering into the archway, you see a narrow corridor that disappears into semi-darkness. The walls are intricately carved with bas-reliefs of jaguars, serpents, and geometric patterns, each line meticulously etched into the stone. Researchers still argue whether these motifs represent spiritual guardianship, astronomical knowledge, or simply aesthetic choices meant to impress visitors. You glide closer, noticing faint traces of red pigment in the carvings, a ghost of color that time could not fully erase. The texture is rough and grainy under your invisible touch, yet there's a rhythm to it, a quiet pulse that hints at intentional design. A soft creak echoes from somewhere deep within the pyramid, almost imperceptible, yet it reaches your ears clearly. The air feels cooler here, tinged with the dampness of underground passageways. Tiny flecks of dust rise lazily in the faint light, catching glimmers from cracks in the stone. You wonder what secrets this corridor has held for centuries. Perhaps offerings once rested here, or rituals were performed under the careful watch of those who built the pyramid. The silence is nearly complete, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind brushing against stone, as if the pyramid itself is breathing slowly, deliberately. Your attention shifts to a faint, almost imperceptible groove along the floor, an alignment that might once have guided ceremonial movement. Shadows from the carvings above play across the corridor, forming shapes that shift with your gaze. A subtle flicker catches your eye, light reflecting off a polished section of stone, hinting at something beyond the immediate darkness. Could this be a sealed doorway, or simply an anomaly in the masonry? Researchers still argue about the pyramid's hidden spaces, debating whether unexcavated chambers might hold relics, inscriptions, or even evidence of unknown rituals. You hover closer, drawn by curiosity, sensing that this corridor is a threshold between known history and mysteries deliberately obscured. The carvings along the walls seem to shift as you move. Jaguars curl and uncurl in the shadows. Serpents weave in and out of geometric patterns, and eyes that are merely stone appear to track your invisible passage. The interplay of light and shadow blurs the boundary between real and imagined, past and present. You notice the faint scent of pollen drifting from somewhere ahead, a gentle reminder that life persists even in these quiet, forgotten spaces. It mingles with the earthy smell of stone and moss, grounding you in the sensory richness of the pyramid. Halfway down the corridor, a small alcove catches your attention. Inside rests a broken idol, cracked but still recognizable as a human-animal hybrid figure. The features are softened by centuries of wear, yet the intent behind its creation is palpable. You wonder why it was left here, almost as if deliberately hidden from prying eyes. The moss around its base is soft and slightly damp, releasing an earthy aroma when disturbed by a drifting breeze. Researchers still argue that these figures might have served as guardians, symbolic markers, or even talismans meant to protect knowledge from being lost. A faint draft rises from deeper within the corridor, carrying with it the sound of something barely audible, a low, resonant hum, or perhaps the distant drip of water. You pause, letting your senses adjust, attuning to the subtle rhythm of the space. Time feels fluid here. Seconds stretch into minutes, minutes fold into centuries, and the line between now and then blurs gently. The corridor seems alive, aware of your presence, patient and watchful. As you glide further, the walls narrow slightly, forcing you to move closer to the stone. The carvings are denser here, interlocking figures creating a tapestry of narrative frozen in relief. The texture of the stone varies, some areas rough, some polished smooth, catching light in unpredictable ways. A tiny glimmer hints at a possible hidden recess, a subtle indentation that could conceal objects or inscriptions long forgotten. You wonder what messages the builders intended for the curious, what secrets they meant to obscure deliberately, and what has been lost to time. A whisper of movement brushes against your ears, a shadow shifting along the far wall, though there is no wind to move it. You tilt your invisible head, letting the sensation settle, and notice a faint play of light across a series of carved serpents, their eyes catching tiny beams from a crack in the ceiling. The corridor seems to guide you forward, encouraging patience, observation, and quiet wonder. Near the end of the passage, the walls open slightly into a small chamber. The ceiling is low, carved with faded motifs of celestial bodies, intertwined serpents, and jaguar masks. Dust motes drift lazily in the air, illuminated by the faintest slivers of sunlight. The room has an eerie calm, as though it has been waiting, untouched, for centuries. You sense the weight of history pressing gently against your awareness, a tangible presence in the cool, shadowed air. You drift closer to a carved stone altar at the center, its surface worn and smooth, hinting at centuries of touch or ritual. Faint traces of pigments remain, suggesting ceremonies once vibrant, now faded to whispers. The scent of stone and moss dominates, yet a trace of incense seems to linger faintly, as if time itself is reluctant to forget. Researchers still argue about the altar's purpose: ritual, ceremonial, astronomical, or symbolic. But here, in the silence, it radiates mystery. The air grows cooler as shadows deepen, and you notice a faint glimmer near the chamber's far wall, a possible doorway, polished and smooth, partially obscured by a fallen stone. Could this lead to a hidden chamber, a space intentionally sealed and erased from memory? You hover, letting anticipation coil gently in your senses, aware that the pyramid has more stories to reveal. Each step, a careful unfolding of secrets. A soft, almost imperceptible hum resonates through the chamber, blending with the whisper of wind and the faint creak of stone. You pause, taking in the textures, the scents, and the play of light and shadow. The corridor behind you, the terraces above, and the chamber ahead create a continuous flow of mystery and wonder. Each element holds meaning, some lost, some deliberately hidden, all inviting careful observation. The sun dips lower, casting the chamber in muted golds and deep blues, merging light and shadow into intricate patterns that flicker across the carvings. You glide closer to the possible doorway, aware that beyond it may lie the next layer of Uxmal's secrets, waiting patiently for those who notice the subtle cues embedded in stone, shadow, and scent. You step into the small chamber, feeling the cool stone walls press gently against your invisible presence. Dust drifts lazily in the faint shafts of sunlight slipping through cracks above, and a whispering wind curls through the room, carrying the scent of damp moss and earth. Shadows crawl along the walls, animating the faded bas-reliefs with a slow, subtle rhythm, and you notice how the carvings almost seem to breathe in response to your gaze. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the far end of the chamber, a circular opening in the ceiling allows a narrow beam of sunlight to strike the floor, illuminating a pattern of serpents, carved in relief around a central jaguar motif. The figures appear frozen, yet alive, eyes glinting faintly in the shifting light. Researchers still argue that such celestial alignments were intentional, possibly marking equinoxes or solstices, yet no definitive explanation exists. You glide closer, tracing the outlines with your mind and imagining the builders carefully positioning stone to capture the sun's path. The room carries a sense of reverence, even though it has long been abandoned. Dusty pottery fragments rest near the walls, each etched with faint glyphs, worn smooth by centuries of neglect. The texture of the stone floor is uneven, granular, yet polished in spots where centuries of hands or ritual objects have brushed against it. A faint hum resonates from somewhere beneath the chamber, almost imperceptible, blending with the whispering wind. You pause, listening, and the sensation of time folding back on itself grows stronger. Seconds seem to stretch, and you feel as if you are both centuries away and right here, observing silently. Above, the circular opening reveals a hint of sky, a brilliant patch of blue framed by worn stone. You notice how the light shifts slowly, moving across the carvings, animating them in delicate patterns. A faint flicker catches your eye, a tiny glimmer at the edge of the chamber floor, suggesting a hidden niche or perhaps a concealed artifact. You wonder why it has been left unguarded, exposed only to the shifting sunlight. Could this be a deliberate test, a way to reward careful observation, or simply the result of centuries of decay? Researchers still argue whether the chamber contained sacred objects meant to remain hidden or public offerings intended for ceremonial use. A gentle breeze stirs the chamber, lifting tiny particles of dust that shimmer in the light, like miniature stars. You notice the faint smell of incense, lingering despite the centuries, a delicate reminder of rituals performed long ago. Moss clings to the edges of the walls and the base of the carved figures, softening the sharp geometry and giving the room a subtle sense of life. Shadows deepen in corners, suggesting passageways or recesses that might conceal further mysteries. You hover near one of these darker spots, imagining what could lie hidden, perhaps a small idol, a carved tablet, or a sealed entrance to a deeper chamber. At the center of the chamber, a low stone altar draws your attention. Its surface is worn smooth, with faint traces of red and yellow pigments clinging to grooves and indentations. You wonder what ceremonies were performed here, what offerings were placed, and perhaps forgotten. The hum from beneath grows slightly stronger, resonating through the stone, a reminder that the pyramid holds layers of history and hidden energy that modern eyes rarely perceive. The combination of sound, scent, and texture creates a meditative atmosphere, almost as if the chamber itself invites reflection and quiet awe. You notice faint glyphs along the walls, deliberately erased in some areas, obscured by intentional scraping or wear. The act of erasure creates a paradox, a record of what was lost, a whisper of knowledge deliberately hidden. Researchers still argue about the purpose of these erased carvings, whether political, religious, or simply an act of preservation through removal. But the ambiguity only deepens the sense of mystery. You drift along the walls, tracing each groove, each shadowed curve, appreciating the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. The chamber seems to pulse softly, a slow rhythm carried by the stone itself, the whispering wind, and your own heightened perception. A faint glow from the sunlit opening above dances across the carvings, illuminating hidden details, tiny jaguar teeth, subtle geometric patterns, and serpentine forms that almost appear to slither when seen from the corner of your eye. You pause, letting the room's subtle magic wash over you. There is a playful quality here too, a sense that the builders might have enjoyed hiding secrets just beyond the obvious, a quiet invitation to explore with care and attention. Near the chamber's edge, you notice a faint outline in the stone floor, perhaps a hidden trapdoor or recessed niche. It catches the light differently than the surrounding stone, hinting at smooth edges beneath the dust. Could it lead to a subterranean passage, a repository of forgotten artifacts, or even a sealed ritual space? You hover, considering the possibilities, aware that this is just one layer of Uxmal's pyramid, and that the mysteries extend far deeper than even this chamber suggests. A faint whisper of wind moves across the carved figures, carrying a subtle sound, almost like a sigh. Shadows twist and stretch, blending with the sunlight in delicate, hypnotic patterns. You notice the way the moss brushes against the stone, the tactile sensation, almost tangible, despite your invisible nature. Time feels slow, elongated, as if centuries are folding gently around this single, quiet chamber. As you linger, the circular opening above projects a moving circle of light across the stone floor, tracing a path from the jaguar relief to the low altar and toward the shadowed corners. The effect is mesmerizing, almost ritualistic, and you sense that it may have been intended to highlight particular carvings or spaces at specific times of day. The air is thick with quiet energy, scent, and history, drawing you deeper into contemplation. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or maybe you've already drifted halfway. You pause, imagining voices across centuries, each one leaving a subtle imprint in the stone, a gentle trace that the invisible observer, like yourself, can perceive. You feel a soft tension, the thrill of discovery mingled with calm, as you prepare to follow the light toward the next layer of hidden architecture. A narrow corridor appears at the far side of the chamber, partially obscured by a leaning stone block. Shadows gather around it, but a glimmer of light suggests passage beyond. You sense that what lies ahead may be another secret space, perhaps containing relics, inscriptions, or mysteries deliberately hidden from view. The interplay of light, shadow, and texture invites patience, curiosity, and quiet reverence as you glide forward, ready to uncover the next layer of Uxmal's secrets. You move cautiously along the narrow corridor that extends from the secret observatory chamber. The stone underfoot is cool, slightly uneven, and worn smooth in the center where countless footsteps once pressed. Shadows cling to the walls, shifting as the sunlight filters through small cracks above, casting intricate patterns on the bas-reliefs. The scent of damp moss mixes with faint traces of incense, lingering despite centuries of neglect. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. The corridor widens slightly, revealing a partially collapsed wall where something unusual catches your attention. Hidden reliefs peek through the rubble, depicting figures with elongated limbs, feline heads, and eyes that glimmer faintly in the filtered light. Moss brushes against your invisible fingers as you trace the carvings, feeling the subtle texture of the stone. Researchers still argue whether these hidden figures represent forgotten deities, ceremonial participants, or symbolic guardians of secret knowledge. The ambiguity itself seems deliberate, a puzzle left for the patient observer. A soft draft drifts along the corridor, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from somewhere above. You notice that some stones are polished in places where no one could reach them easily, surfaces that catch the faint light, hinting at passages or objects deliberately concealed. Could these have been markers for rituals, guides for hidden chambers, or playful tests by the builders for the curious? You pause, letting your senses attune to the subtle energy in the air, feeling time stretch and fold in the dimly lit space. Near the end of the collapsed section, a series of carved glyphs lines the wall, partially eroded but still discernible. Tiny fragments of pigment cling stubbornly to the stone, traces of red and yellow that once made the figures vivid. Researchers still argue about the meaning of these glyphs, whether they record astronomical events, historical deeds, or coded spiritual instructions. But the mystery draws you closer, compelling your attention. You hover along the carvings, noting the slight indentations and grooves, the way shadows play across each line, hinting at deliberate alignment or hidden message. A faint sound catches your ear, almost imperceptible, a dripping somewhere deeper in the passage, resonating faintly against stone walls. The air is cool, slightly damp, and the echo of the drip stretches unnervingly in the corridor. You drift closer, feeling the texture of the floor stones beneath your invisible feet. The corridor seems alive with whispers of the past, the rustle of garments, the quiet footfalls of priests or guards long gone, the echo of chants or distant instruments. You wonder why these sounds feel almost tangible, like time itself has folded, leaving faint traces for those who pay attention. The collapsed wall leads you to a narrow chamber barely large enough for a single person to stand. Its walls are covered in faint, hidden bas-reliefs, depicting jaguars, serpents, and abstract geometric patterns intertwined in elaborate sequences. Moss creeps across the lower portions, softening the sharp edges of the carvings. A faint metallic tang lingers in the air, hinting at weathered copper or ceremonial tools once placed here. You glide closer to the figures, feeling the subtle play of light and shadow on their surfaces, and imagine the builders moving through this very chamber, carefully aligning each carving with the rhythm of sunlight or ritual motion. Near the center of the chamber, you discover a small stone pedestal, worn smooth and partially obscured by debris. It holds fragments of pottery etched with intricate designs, now faded with age. The texture of the ceramic is cool and rough, evidence of skilled craftsmanship. You wonder what was offered here, what prayers were whispered, and whether these objects were meant to be retrieved or left to decay. Researchers still argue whether such altars were functional or symbolic, a way to mark spiritual territory while obscuring the full meaning from outsiders. A faint shaft of light pierces the chamber from a crack in the ceiling, illuminating a carved niche high above the pedestal. Tiny details glimmer as the light shifts, eyes of serpents and jaguars catching the sun, polished stones reflecting subtle patterns. The effect is hypnotic, almost ritualistic, and you sense that it was deliberately designed to guide attention, perhaps marking an astronomical event or highlighting a sacred object hidden long ago. The faint smell of moss and stone mingles with the subtle aroma of aged pigments, creating a multi-sensory layer that immerses you completely. The chamber narrows at the far end, leading to what appears to be a small doorway, partially sealed by rubble. A glimmer of light seeps through the cracks, and you sense a deliberate concealment, as if the builders intended to obscure whatever lies beyond. Could it be a repository of knowledge, a sealed ceremonial space, or something even more enigmatic? You hover closer, letting anticipation coil gently in your senses, aware that the mysteries of Uxmal's pyramid extend deeper than any single chamber or corridor. A faint hum resonates through the walls, subtle and almost imperceptible, blending with the whisper of wind and the distant drip of water. Time feels slow here. Moments stretch, and the sensation of centuries folding together is palpable. Shadows twist and shift across the carvings, creating fleeting impressions of movement, almost as if the figures themselves are aware of your presence. You notice the subtle play of light, the texture of stone, and the lingering scent of earth and moss, all merging into a quiet, immersive rhythm. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or maybe you've already drifted halfway. The chamber seems to respond to your attention, the carving's shadows deepening and the air thickening with anticipation. You drift closer to the partially sealed doorway, feeling the weight of centuries pressing gently against the stones. Each detail, the polished surfaces, the moss, the faint hum, reminds you that the pyramid was designed to conceal as much as it reveals, inviting the patient observer to uncover its secrets carefully. You linger near the doorway, imagining what might lie beyond, a deeper passage, hidden artifacts, or inscriptions deliberately erased from memory. The interplay of light, shadow, and texture creates a tactile, almost musical rhythm, and you sense that the next step in your journey may reveal layers of Uxmal's mysteries even more profound than the chambers you have already explored. You hover, breathing in the scents, tracing textures with your mind, and letting the pyramid's quiet energy guide you gently onward. You press gently against the rubble that partially seals the doorway, feeling the cool stone edges beneath your invisible presence. Dust rises in lazy swirls, catching faint shafts of light from cracks above, and the air carries the mingled scents of damp earth, aged stone, and the faint remnants of pigments long faded. Shadows gather in corners and along the low walls, bending and stretching with the flickering light, and you notice how the carvings in the chamber beyond seem to shift subtly as you approach. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. Pushing a bit further, you discover the doorway leads to a narrow passage, barely wide enough to allow movement. The walls here are smoother, worn over centuries, but etched with faint reliefs that hint at a narrative. Serpents curling around jaguar figures, abstract geometric patterns, and symbols that elude immediate interpretation. Researchers still argue whether these carvings were part of ceremonial instruction, secret communication, or simple ornamentation, yet their arrangement feels deliberate, as if guiding the observer's gaze along a carefully planned path. The faint hum of air moving through the corridor resonates gently against the stone, creating a low, almost musical undertone. A sudden flicker of movement catches your attention, shadows playing tricks as the light shifts across carvings and cracks. The floor is uneven, with small dips and ridges that suggest centuries of wear and perhaps hidden chambers below. You drift closer to a carved niche in the wall, noticing faint red traces of pigment along its edges. Could this have been a marker, a point of focus for ritual or observation? The texture of the stone here is rough, yet smooth in places, evidence of hands long gone, shaping and polishing with care. Further along, a faint breeze carries the scent of moss and earth from an unseen opening, suggesting that the passage continues beyond the current chamber. Tiny particles of dust drift lazily in the filtered light, shimmering like microscopic stars in a dark sky. You notice how the carvings appear to shift as you glide past, serpents curling and uncurling, jaguar eyes glinting, geometric patterns folding in on themselves. The effect is hypnotic, drawing you deeper into the corridor's subtle mysteries. Halfway through the passage, the walls narrow suddenly, forming a small chamber with a low ceiling. The space is intimate, almost claustrophobic, yet it hums with a sense of importance. In the center, a small altar rests, partially covered by debris. Its surface is smooth, worn by centuries of touch, and faint pigments cling to carved grooves. Researchers still argue whether such altars were used for offerings, ceremonial acts, or simply as symbolic markers, but their placement here feels deliberate, calculated to catch the observer's attention. The faint sound of dripping water echoes from somewhere deeper, blending with the soft hum of the stone walls. The air is cooler here, slightly damp, and carries the earthy aroma of moss and decayed organic matter. You glide closer to a corner of the chamber where a series of faint glyphs remain, partially obscured by lichen and dust. The characters are almost entirely eroded, yet a careful eye can discern subtle patterns. You wonder whether these were instructions, warnings, or messages intended for a select few. Their ambiguity adds to the corridor's quiet tension, a mystery that persists despite centuries of decay. Above the altar, a narrow slit in the ceiling allows a single beam of sunlight to penetrate the chamber. The light moves slowly across the carvings, highlighting serpentine figures and jaguar masks in a soft, golden glow. You notice a faint metallic shimmer on one section of the wall, perhaps a polished stone or ancient inlay reflecting the sunlight in fleeting flashes. Could this have been intended as a signal, a guiding light, or merely an ornamental flourish? Researchers still argue about the alignment of light and carvings in Uxmal's inner chambers, debating whether celestial observation or ceremonial timing played a role in design. As you explore further, your attention is drawn to a small, partially hidden recess in the wall. The indentation is subtle, almost invisible, unless one knows where to look. Inside lies a tiny, cracked idol, worn smooth by time, but still recognizable as a feline-human hybrid. Its eyes, once vivid with pigment, are now dulled, yet the aura of deliberate craftsmanship remains. You pause, letting your senses take in the faint scent of stone and moss, imagining the rituals or ceremonies that may have surrounded this figure centuries ago. The corridor continues beyond the chamber, leading to a slight incline where the stone floor has been worn nearly flat. Tiny fissures catch the filtered sunlight, glinting faintly, and shadows stretch along the walls in slow, deliberate motion. You notice how the carvings guide your gaze, serpents curling in directions that seem almost instructional, jaguars crouching as though watching your every move. The passage feels alive, each stone a participant in the narrative of Uxmal, quietly observing and interacting with those who tread its hidden paths. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps your eyes are already halfway closed, drifting between reality and the whispers of the past. A gentle creak echoes through the corridor, subtle yet distinct, as if the building itself is acknowledging your invisible presence. You sense a doorway ahead, partially obscured by shadows and moss, glowing faintly where the sunlight catches its edges. It seems to promise further secrets, deeper mysteries, and perhaps artifacts deliberately hidden by the builders. The passage narrows once more as you approach the doorway, the walls closing in slightly. The faint hum of air and stone resonates through the space, blending with the distant dripping and occasional flutter of dust. You glide closer, noting the subtle variations in texture, the moss creeping into cracks, and the faint metallic tang of mineral deposits. Every detail seems purposeful, every shadow a hint, every beam of light a guide. You wonder what lies beyond, a sealed chamber, hidden relics, or inscriptions erased from memory. As you pause at the threshold, the interplay of shadow and light creates patterns that flicker like living beings across the carvings. The air is thick with anticipation, the combined sense of stone, moss, and faint traces of pigments creating a multi-sensory landscape. You hover quietly, absorbing the textures, the soundscape, and the history embedded in every inch of the corridor. The next step promises revelation, another layer of Uxmal's quiet mysteries waiting to unfold before your unseen gaze. You slip through the partially hidden doorway, entering a chamber that immediately feels different, older, quieter, and somehow more secretive. The air is cooler here, carrying the scent of damp stone and faint traces of moss, mingled with something indefinably metallic. Shadows cling to the walls, bending and twisting with the subtle shifts of sunlight from cracks above. Tiny motes of dust float lazily in the air, illuminated by golden slivers of light, giving the impression of a suspended, timeless moment. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center of the chamber stands a low pedestal, its surface polished smooth over centuries. Upon it rests a small idol, a feline human hybrid with delicate carvings tracing its features. The eyes are chipped, but retain a faint glimmer, catching what little light enters the chamber. Researchers still argue whether such figures were symbolic guardians, ceremonial objects, or markers of hidden knowledge, but the placement here suggests deliberate concealment. You hover closer, noting the texture of the stone, rough in some places, silky smooth in others, shaped by hands long gone. A faint hum resonates through the chamber, almost imperceptible yet steady, blending with the soft whistle of air slipping through cracks in the walls. You follow the sound, gliding past walls etched with serpentine patterns, jaguar motifs, and geometric sequences, each line worn yet remarkably precise. The carvings seem to guide your gaze toward a small recess in the far wall, partially obscured by moss. Could this be a hidden niche, a secret compartment, or simply a decorative flourish? You pause, letting curiosity coil gently in your senses. Near the chamber's edge, you notice faint glyphs, partially erased, smoothed over by deliberate abrasion or the slow passage of time. Researchers still argue whether these erased markings were warnings, sacred inscriptions, or messages intended for select eyes only. You trace their faint outlines with your invisible touch, imagining the original brilliance of color and intention, and the centuries of secrecy that have since enveloped them. The chamber feels like a whisper from the past, inviting you to listen carefully, observe keenly, and follow its subtle guidance. A sudden flicker of sunlight catches the corner of the chamber, glinting off a polished fragment embedded in the wall. You drift closer, feeling the slight variation in texture, noting that the stone seems smoother where light touches. Could it mark a passage, or was it designed purely for aesthetic effect? A hidden cue left by the builders for those perceptive enough to notice. The faint smell of moss rises again, mingling with the metallic tang of mineral deposits, creating a rich sensory tapestry. The pedestal at the center draws your attention once more. You imagine offerings placed here, fragments of pottery, small carved objects, and perhaps traces of pigments now lost to time. The surface is cool, worn smooth by centuries of ritual touch, and the air hums faintly around it, lending an almost meditative quality to the space. You notice a subtle draft from the recess in the wall, carrying a whisper of sound like distant water or shifting stone. The corridor beyond seems to call softly, teasing you with what lies just out of sight. Above, a narrow slit allows a thin beam of sunlight to filter in, illuminating a section of carved figures near the ceiling. Jaguars, serpents, and abstract forms seem to twist subtly as the light moves, creating fleeting moments where stone appears almost alive. You pause, marveling at the builder's attention to detail, the alignment, the composition, the subtle interplay of light and shadow. Researchers still argue whether such alignment served astronomical, ceremonial, or symbolic purposes, but the effect is undeniably mesmerizing. Along the far wall, a low recess catches your attention. Tiny traces of pigment cling to its surface, red and ochre hues suggesting ritual significance. You glide closer, brushing past moss and feeling the granular texture of stone. Could this have been a hidden repository for sacred objects, or a secret message etched for select eyes? You wonder what stories have been lost, what knowledge deliberately concealed, and what rituals these hidden spaces once witnessed. The hum of the chamber, the interplay of shadows, and the faint scent of moss combine to create an immersive, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Time seems to blur here. Seconds stretch into minutes, minutes fold into centuries, and the line between now and then softens. You notice subtle, almost imperceptible movements in the shadows, a flicker across a carved serpent, a glint in the jaguar's eye, as though the chamber itself is aware of your presence. You hover, absorbing the rhythm, texture, and scent, letting the mysterious energy guide your invisible journey deeper into the pyramid. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps you've already drifted halfway into dreams. A faint, distant creak echoes through the chamber, subtle but distinct, reminding you that stone remembers, even when humans forget. You glide closer to the recess, sensing that beyond it may lie another chamber, another layer of secrets, waiting patiently for discovery. At the far end of the chamber, a low archway emerges, partially blocked by a fallen stone. Light flickers across its surface, highlighting subtle carvings, a jaguar, a coiled serpent, and geometric symbols aligned in careful patterns. Could this doorway conceal a passage to even deeper mysteries, artifacts deliberately hidden, or inscriptions erased to protect knowledge? You pause, letting anticipation and curiosity coil gently within you, ready to follow the pyramid's quiet guidance into the unknown. The interplay of shadow, light, and texture creates a tactile, almost musical rhythm. The air is thick with the scent of stone, moss, and faint pigments, and the soft hum resonates in your invisible presence. Every detail seems purposeful. The polished surfaces, the carved motifs, the hidden recesses, each one designed to guide the observer, to reveal layers of history slowly and deliberately. You hover quietly, absorbing the quiet energy, ready to step beyond the archway and uncover yet another secret of Uxmal's enduring mysteries. You slip through the low archway, entering a passage that immediately feels narrower, more intimate, and somehow older than the chambers you have traversed. The stone walls are cool under your invisible presence, worn smooth in some areas and rough with jagged edges in others. Shadows cling to corners, twisting as the light from tiny cracks above flickers and dances across faint carvings. The scent of damp moss is stronger here, mingling with a faint metallic tang, as if the passage itself remembers centuries of ritual activity. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. The corridor slopes gently downward, and the floor beneath you shifts subtly, granular in some places, polished smooth in others. Tiny flecks of dust drift in the air, catching faint beams of sunlight and glittering like miniature stars suspended in motion. You notice carvings on the walls depicting serpents coiled around jaguar forms, interlaced with geometric patterns, each line precise yet eroded over time. Researchers still argue whether these motifs are purely decorative, symbolic, or part of a secret language meant to guide initiates through the pyramid's hidden spaces. You glide closer, tracing the lines with your invisible presence and noting the interplay of light and shadow that seems almost intentional. Halfway down the passage, a faint hum rises, subtle and resonant, blending with the soft whistle of air moving through cracks in the stone. You drift closer, noticing how the wall's textures change, small indentations, polished areas, and hidden niches that could contain relics or inscriptions. Could one of these hidden spaces hold a forgotten artifact, or perhaps a message deliberately erased from memory? You pause, sensing the weight of centuries pressing gently around you, feeling time stretch and fold within the narrow passage. Near a bend in the corridor, you encounter a small recess partially obscured by moss and debris. Inside lies a fragment of a ceramic vessel, etched with faint symbols, now almost unreadable. The surface is rough and cool, evidence of hands long gone that shaped it with intention. You wonder about its purpose, an offering, a ceremonial object, or a key to a ritual now lost. Researchers still argue about such fragments, debating whether they were functional, symbolic, or part of a larger network of hidden meanings. The mystery deepens with every observation. A flicker of movement in the shadows catches your attention, though nothing is there. Light reflects off tiny mineral veins in the stone, creating the illusion of shifting figures. The corridor seems to pulse gently with an unseen rhythm, the interplay of shadow and light guiding your gaze. Above, a narrow crack in the ceiling allows sunlight to slant across carvings, highlighting jaguar masks, coiled serpents, and abstract forms that seem almost alive. The effect is mesmerizing, drawing you deeper into the pyramid's quiet enigma. The passage narrows again, leading to a small chamber barely large enough to accommodate a single person. At its center rests a low stone altar, worn smooth by centuries of touch, with faint pigments clinging to grooves and indentations. The scent of moss is stronger here, mixing with a hint of earthy incense that lingers faintly in the air. Researchers still argue whether such altars were primarily for offerings, ceremonial use, or symbolic markers, yet the deliberate placement in this hidden chamber suggests intentional secrecy. You glide closer, absorbing the texture, scent, and subtle energy of the space. Near the chamber's edges, faint glyphs are etched into the walls, partially obscured by lichen and wear. Some have been deliberately erased, their meanings lost or hidden. You trace their outlines with your invisible touch, imagining the bright pigments they may have once held, and wonder what knowledge was meant only for select eyes. The hum of air through the chamber, the flicker of sunlight, and the gentle whisper of dust particles create a meditative rhythm, encouraging careful observation and quiet reflection. A narrow slit in the ceiling allows a focused beam of sunlight to illuminate a portion of the carvings near the altar. The light moves slowly, highlighting jaguar figures, serpents, and abstract patterns in a hypnotic display. Could this alignment have served as a guide for ritual observation, a marker of time, or a secret signal? Researchers still argue whether such features were purely ceremonial or designed to communicate subtle information to those who understood the hidden language of the pyramid. As you drift closer to the chamber's far wall, a partially hidden niche catches your attention. It's small, recessed, and just large enough to hold a small object. Inside, you glimpse a tiny, cracked idol, its features worn but recognizable as a hybrid human-animal figure. The moss at its base is soft and slightly damp, releasing an earthy aroma when disturbed by drifting air. You wonder what role this figure played, what rituals it witnessed, and whether it was ever meant to be discovered again. The air grows cooler, and the shadows deepen as you linger, feeling the gentle hum of energy through the stone. Light shifts across the carvings in slow, mesmerizing patterns. You pause, absorbing the textures, sounds, and scents, letting the quiet tension of secrecy unfold into wonder. Each detail, the polished surfaces, moss-covered cracks, faint pigments, and carved reliefs, speaks of deliberate concealment and patient observation. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps your eyelids are already fluttering shut, drifting halfway between awareness and dreams. A faint, distant creak echoes through the passage, subtle but distinct, as though the pyramid itself acknowledges your presence. You sense another chamber ahead, perhaps containing deeper relics, hidden inscriptions, or deliberately sealed mysteries waiting to reveal themselves. The anticipation coils gently around you, inviting careful, silent exploration. You drift toward the next threshold, feeling the textures of stone, the faint hum of air, and the lingering scent of moss. Light flickers across the narrow corridor ahead, casting shadows that hint at what may lie beyond. Each step is an invitation to uncover another layer of Uxmal's enduring secrets, an invisible journey through a space designed to hold mysteries for those patient enough to notice them. You enter the next chamber, feeling a subtle drop in temperature, as if the stone itself is breathing gently around you. The air is thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, faintly spiced with a trace of old incense. Shadows cling to the walls and ceiling, shifting as a narrow shaft of sunlight filters in through a high crack, illuminating jaguar masks, coiled serpents, and geometric patterns with a soft, golden glow. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center of the chamber rests a rectangular stone altar, its surface polished smooth over centuries, faintly dusted with debris. Tiny fragments of pottery lie scattered at its base, etched with designs now barely visible. Researchers still argue whether these were offerings for ceremonial rituals, markers of astronomical events, or symbolic gestures meant to conceal knowledge. You drift closer, brushing past moss along the walls, feeling the uneven texture of stone that has been touched and retouched across generations. A faint hum reverberates through the chamber, subtle yet persistent, blending with the soft whistle of air flowing through cracks. You glide toward a recess in the far wall, partially hidden behind a leaning stone slab. Inside lies a small idol, a feline-human hybrid with chipped eyes and delicate carvings across its body. The moss surrounding it is soft and damp, giving off a faint earthy aroma. You wonder why it was hidden here, whether as a sacred guardian, a ritual object, or perhaps a message meant to be found only by the most careful observer. Researchers still argue whether these niches contain talismans of protection, markers of forbidden knowledge, or ceremonial symbols lost to time. The chamber is rich with sensory layers. The air carries the damp, earthy smell of stone and moss, mixed with faint mineral tangs. Tiny particles of dust drift lazily in the sunlight, moving in slow, hypnotic swirls. The carvings on the walls seem almost alive in the shifting light. Serpents twist, jaguars crouch, and geometric motifs pulse with a rhythm that feels deliberate, inviting the observer to trace the lines, to follow the story carved in stone. A narrow slit in the ceiling allows a focused beam of sunlight to strike the altar, highlighting subtle pigments that cling stubbornly to grooves and carvings. The light moves slowly as the day progresses, casting fleeting patterns across the walls. Could this alignment have been intentional, a marker of celestial events, or a ritual focus? You pause, letting the chamber's quiet energy wash over you. Time stretches and blurs, seconds fold into centuries, and you feel simultaneously present and centuries removed. The far wall contains another recess, faintly outlined in the stone. Inside rests a fragment of carved pottery, red and ochre traces lingering in the grooves. The surface is rough to the touch, worn by centuries of handling or ceremonial placement. You imagine the hands that once held it, the rituals performed, the secrets passed silently along generations, the hum of air, the faint drip of water from above, and the muted sunlight create a meditative rhythm, encouraging deep observation and reflection. Shadows deepen as your attention drifts toward the corners of the chamber. A faint flicker catches your eye. A polished stone embedded in the wall reflects sunlight briefly, as if marking something intentionally. Could it conceal a small passage, a hidden niche, or a deliberate signal for initiates? Researchers still argue whether these reflective surfaces were purely decorative, symbolic, or functional. The ambiguity adds a layer of tension, the thrill of discovery mingling with calm observation. You notice a subtle draft coming from a crack at the far edge of the chamber. The air's cooler, carrying faint echoes of distant dripping water. Tiny flecks of moss cling to the ceiling edges, releasing earthy scents as air brushes past. You hover closer, letting your senses map the space in detail. The polished altar, the mossy walls, the carvings that twist in subtle patterns, and the tiny traces of pigment that hint at vanished ceremonies. Near the doorway on the far side, another narrow passage leads further into the pyramid. Shadows stretch and flicker along its walls, hinting at hidden carvings and niches not immediately visible. You feel the quiet anticipation of discovery coil gently in your senses, aware that this next corridor may hold artifacts, inscriptions, or rooms deliberately erased from memory. The chamber behind you hums softly with centuries of latent energy, a reminder that these spaces were carefully crafted to conceal as much as they reveal. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps you've already drifted halfway into dreams. The subtle interplay of shadows, light, and textures continues to guide your attention. You glide forward, drawn by the promise of deeper secrets, faint hums, and carefully hidden chambers awaiting those who observe with patience and care. The passage narrows at the end, and the air grows cooler, tinged with moss and faint mineral scent. Sunlight filters weakly through cracks, illuminating faint bas-reliefs on the walls, coiled serpents, crouching jaguars, and abstract geometric motifs. You pause, tracing the lines with your invisible presence, appreciating the deliberate concealment, the subtle guidance, and the centuries of quiet observation embedded in every stone. You glide into the next chamber, a low, elongated room where shadows stretch across worn stone walls. The air is cooler here, thick with the scent of damp moss and faint traces of aged incense lingering from rituals long past. Dust motes float in the narrow beams of sunlight that seep through tiny cracks above, shimmering like suspended stars in a muted sky. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center lies a rectangular altar, its surface polished smooth, sprinkled with fragments of pottery, etched with faded glyphs. You drift closer, noting the texture, rough in some areas, silky in others, evidence of generations of hands that once placed offerings or touched the stone reverently. Researchers still argue whether these glyphs were ceremonial, symbolic, or instructional, but their presence adds layers of mystery to the chamber. A faint hum resonates through the stone, blending with the soft whistle of air moving through cracks, creating a meditative rhythm. Along the walls, intricate carvings depict serpents winding around jaguar figures, punctuated by geometric shapes and abstract symbols. Tiny traces of red and ochre pigments cling stubbornly to grooves, glinting faintly in the filtered sunlight. You notice how the shadows shift across the figures as the light moves, giving the impression that the serpents coil and uncoil, jaguars crouch and spring, almost alive under your gaze. Could these carvings have been designed to guide initiates, mark celestial events, or conceal secret messages? Researchers still argue, yet the ambiguity only deepens the sense of intrigue. Near a corner, a narrow recess is partially hidden by moss and debris. Inside rests a small, cracked idol, a feline-human hybrid with faint traces of pigment on its features. You wonder about its purpose: guardian, ceremonial figure, or secret marker, and the hands that once placed it here centuries ago. A subtle draft flows from an unseen crack in the wall, carrying a faint scent of earth and mineral. The chamber feels alive with whispers of the past, every surface holding traces of rituals, ceremonies, and forgotten knowledge. The chamber narrows slightly toward the far wall, where a low archway emerges, partially obscured by a leaning stone block. Sunlight filters through cracks above, illuminating the carvings along the arch: coiled serpents, crouching jaguars, and abstract patterns. Their alignment is precise, almost ritualistic, and you notice a faint metallic gleam on one section of the stone. Could this mark a hidden compartment, or was it designed purely for visual effect? Researchers still argue whether such gleams were functional, symbolic, or playful. You drift closer to the arch, noting the subtle textures of the stone. Moss clings to cracks, and the faint metallic scent of mineral deposits mingles with the earthy aroma of damp stone. Shadows flicker across carvings in delicate, hypnotic patterns. Time seems to slow here, stretching seconds into minutes, minutes into centuries. The interplay of light, shadow, and texture creates a rhythmic, almost musical atmosphere, inviting careful observation and quiet reflection. A faint flicker catches your eye, a small recess hidden behind the arch's base. Inside rests fragments of pottery etched with geometric patterns and animal motifs, worn smooth by centuries of touch. You imagine the hands that once held them, the ceremonies they participated in, and the secrets they may have witnessed. The subtle hum of the chamber, the shifting sunlight, and the faint whisper of wind combine to form an immersive, multi-sensory experience. Further along the archway, you notice faint erasures on the walls, glyphs and carvings have been deliberately smoothed over, partially lost to time, or intentionally removed. Researchers still argue whether these erased markings were political, ceremonial, or spiritual, yet their presence leaves a palpable mystery, a suggestion that some knowledge was meant to remain hidden. You hover near the erasures, tracing the faint outlines with your invisible presence, curious about what was intentionally concealed. The narrow corridor beyond the arch slopes slightly downward. Tiny fissures catch the weak sunlight, glinting intermittently while shadows twist across the walls. The carvings seem to guide your gaze, coiled serpents pointing subtly toward the passage's end, jaguar masks crouching in quiet vigilance. You sense layers of intention in every stone, hidden chambers, deliberately concealed niches, and textures shaped to reward careful observation. The pyramid feels alive with secrets, and your invisible presence allows you to witness them unfolding silently. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps your eyelids are already half closed, drifting between awareness and dreams. The faint hum continues, blending with distant dripping water and shifting air, creating a calm yet expectant atmosphere. Shadows deepen, light flickers, and the air thickens with centuries of latent energy. You glide forward, drawn toward the next threshold, curious what hidden chamber or artifact lies beyond. Near the corridor's end, a low doorway emerges, partially obscured by debris and moss. Sunlight catches carved figures along the threshold, revealing serpents, jaguars, and abstract motifs. Could this doorway conceal another chamber, deeper secrets, or inscriptions deliberately erased from memory? You pause, letting anticipation coil gently in your senses, ready to step beyond and uncover the next layer of Uxmal's enigmatic architecture. You step through the low doorway, entering a chamber that immediately feels different, darker, quieter, and somehow more secluded than any space you've encountered so far. The stone underfoot is uneven, cold, and smooth in places where centuries of footsteps have polished it. Shadows gather in corners, stretching across carved walls in slow, deliberate patterns. The faint scent of moss is stronger here, mingling with a metallic tang that hints at mineral deposits in hidden niches. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center, a low stone altar rests, its surface worn smooth, holding fragments of pottery and small carved objects. Traces of pigment cling stubbornly to grooves, faint red and ochre streaks hinting at ceremonies long forgotten. Researchers still argue whether these were offerings, ritual tools, or symbolic markers, but their presence creates a quiet tension, suggesting a deliberate layering of secrecy. You drift closer, letting your senses absorb the textures, the faint hum of the chamber, and the gentle movement of air through narrow cracks. The walls are etched with serpentine figures, coiling around crouching jaguars, punctuated by abstract geometric patterns. Sunlight filters through narrow slits, glinting off polished stone surfaces in subtle flashes. You notice how the shadows seem almost alive, shifting as the light moves, creating an illusion of motion among the carvings. Could these be intentional cues, guiding the observer along hidden paths or marking astronomical alignments? Researchers still argue, but the effect is mesmerizing, drawing your attention deeper into the chamber's quiet mysteries. Near the far wall, a small recess is partially obscured by moss and debris. Inside rests a tiny, cracked idol, its feline human features faintly visible. You sense the hands that placed it there centuries ago, the rituals performed in silence, and the careful concealment intended to protect knowledge from outsiders. A subtle draft carries the faint scent of earth and mineral, enhancing the immersive, multisensory atmosphere. Shadows flicker across the niche, and the air seems to pulse with quiet energy. A narrow slit in the ceiling allows a thin shaft of sunlight to illuminate part of the altar. The light shifts slowly as the day progresses, highlighting faint pigment traces and polished stone surfaces. Could this alignment have been deliberate, a signal for initiates, a guide for ritual, or a marker of celestial events? Researchers still argue whether such alignments were practical, symbolic, or purely aesthetic. You hover near the light, tracing the delicate textures of stone, pigment, and carvings, feeling a deepening connection to the builder's intentions. The chamber narrows toward a low archway on the far side, partially hidden by a leaning stone slab. Carvings along the arch depict coiled serpents, crouching jaguars, and abstract patterns, precise and hypnotic. Sunlight catches a small metallic fragment embedded in the stone, creating a brief, fleeting glint. Could it mark a hidden niche, a deliberate visual cue, or simply a decorative flourish? Researchers still argue, adding to the chamber's quiet tension. You drift closer, allowing the interplay of shadow, light, and texture to guide your focus. Along the walls, faint glyphs remain, partially erased by deliberate abrasion or slow erosion. You trace their outlines, imagining the bright pigments they once held, wondering what knowledge was meant only for select eyes. The soft hum of air, combined with distant dripping water and shifting shadows, creates a rhythm that draws your attention, slowing your perception of time. Seconds fold into minutes, minutes into centuries, as you explore with quiet, deliberate observation. A small niche in the corner holds fragments of pottery etched with jaguar and serpent motifs. The surface is rough, worn smooth by centuries of ceremonial handling. You imagine the hands that once held them, the offerings they carried, and the secrets now lost. A faint metallic scent rises from the stone nearby, blending with the earthy aroma of moss, creating an immersive sensory environment that pulls your attention deeper into the mysteries of the pyramid. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps your eyelids are already heavy, drifting between awareness and dreams. Shadows deepen across the walls, flickering gently as light filters through cracks. You sense another doorway ahead, partially obscured, perhaps containing more hidden relics or inscriptions erased intentionally. The anticipation coils gently in your senses, a quiet promise of deeper secrets waiting to be observed. At the far end of the chamber, a narrow, low doorway emerges, blocked slightly by moss and debris. Sunlight catches faint carvings along the threshold, coiled serpents, crouching jaguars, and abstract geometric patterns. Could this passage conceal deeper chambers, hidden artifacts, or inscriptions deliberately erased? You hover near the threshold, feeling textures, inhaling scents, and letting the pyramid's quiet energy guide you onward into the next layer of mystery. You glide through the low doorway, entering a chamber that feels almost sacred in its quiet intensity. The air is cooler here, thick with the earthy scent of moss and stone, mingled with the faint trace of incense long extinguished. Dust floats lazily in narrow beams of sunlight, filtering through cracks in the ceiling, casting tiny, shimmering motes like stars suspended in midair. Shadows cling to the walls, twisting across carvings in slow, deliberate patterns. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center of the chamber rests a low stone altar, polished smooth by centuries of careful touch. Fragments of pottery lie scattered at its base, etched with faded glyphs that are almost impossible to discern. Researchers still argue whether these glyphs were ceremonial, symbolic, or instructional, but their presence adds a layer of intrigue, suggesting rituals now lost to time. You drift closer, brushing against patches of moss along the walls, feeling the subtle texture variations where human hands once labored to shape the stone. The walls are etched with jaguar figures crouching among coiled serpents, interlaced with abstract geometric patterns. Tiny remnants of red and ochre pigments cling stubbornly to grooves, catching the sunlight and creating faint, fleeting flashes. You notice how shadows shift as the light moves, giving the illusion that the jaguars breathe, the serpents coil, and the geometric motifs pulse in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. Could these carvings have been designed as guides, astronomical markers, or secret messages? Researchers still argue, leaving the meaning tantalizingly unresolved. Near a corner, a narrow recess, partially hidden by moss and debris, draws your attention. Inside rests a tiny idol, a feline human hybrid with chipped features, its eyes dulled but still catching faint glimmers of light. You imagine the hands that placed it here, the ceremonies it witnessed, and the careful concealment meant to protect its secret. A gentle draft flows through a crack in the wall, carrying earthy scents and the faint whisper of distant water, as if the chamber itself were breathing softly. A narrow slit in the ceiling allows a slender beam of sunlight to illuminate the altar. The light shifts slowly, revealing subtle traces of pigment and polished stone. Could this alignment have been intentional, marking celestial events, or guiding ritual practice? Researchers still argue whether such features were functional, symbolic, or aesthetic, adding layers of quiet mystery to the chamber. You hover closer, tracing textures, observing shadows, and inhaling the faint aroma of moss and mineral-rich stone. Along the far wall, faint erasures hint at glyphs or carvings that have been deliberately smoothed away. You trace their outlines with your invisible presence, imagining the stories or knowledge once held there, now partially. The chamber hums softly with energy, the faint drip of water echoing against stone, and the shifting light creating a hypnotic, immersive rhythm. You notice how time seems to fold here. Seconds stretch, minutes compress, and centuries converge in a silent tapestry of experience. A small niche near the altar contains fragments of pottery etched with serpents, jaguars, and geometric designs. The surface is worn smooth, evidence of centuries of ceremonial handling. You imagine the hands that placed these items, the offerings made, and the hidden knowledge that may have been encoded in these subtle details. The interplay of shadows, textures, and scent creates a quiet, meditative environment that invites patient observation and gentle reflection. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or maybe you've already drifted halfway into dreams. A faint metallic glint on a section of the wall catches your attention, reflecting the filtered sunlight. Could it indicate a hidden niche, a passage, or a deliberate signal for those who know where to look. Researchers still argue, yet the uncertainty itself heightens the chamber's quiet tension, keeping curiosity alive. The corridor beyond the chamber beckons gently. Shadows stretch across carved figures on the walls, flickering in the slowly moving light. Polished surfaces catch your attention. Moss creeps along cracks, and the faint hum of air moving through the stone resonates like a soft whisper. You glide forward, drawn toward another low doorway, partially blocked by rubble, curious what secrets lie beyond. Every detail, the polished altar, moss-covered niches, faint pigment traces, and carvings that seem to breathe, suggests careful intention. The pyramid's energy guides you silently, rewarding patience and observation, drawing you into deeper mysteries. You pause at the threshold, savoring the interplay of light, shadow, texture, and scent, knowing that beyond this doorway, more hidden chambers and artifacts await your invisible gaze. You glide through the low doorway, entering a chamber that feels markedly different, spacious, yet intimate, as though designed to draw the observer into quiet reflection. The air is cool and thick, with the earthy scent of moss and damp stone, faintly spiced with remnants of incense that linger centuries after ceremonial use. Dust floats in narrow shafts of sunlight, filtering through cracks in the ceiling, glimmering like suspended stars. Shadows cling to the walls and ceiling, twisting in slow, hypnotic movements. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the chamber's center, a broad stone altar rests, polished smooth over centuries, its surface dotted with small fragments of pottery and worn carvings. Traces of red and ochre pigments cling stubbornly in grooves, faint but persistent. Researchers still argue whether these were ceremonial offerings, symbolic markers, or instruments for instructing initiates in secret rites. You drift closer, brushing past moss along the walls, feeling subtle textures that hint at centuries of human interaction. The chamber hums faintly with energy, a resonance that blends with distant dripping water echoing through stone passages. The walls are etched with serpents, coiling around crouching jaguars, interlaced with abstract geometric motifs. Faint pigments catch the sunlight, producing fleeting flashes that bring the carvings to life in subtle ways. The interplay of light and shadow creates the illusion that the jaguars crouch and move, the serpents coil and uncoil, and geometric patterns pulse almost rhythmically. Could these carvings have served as guides for rituals, celestial markers, or messages only interpretable by those initiated into the pyramid's hidden knowledge? Researchers still argue, yet the ambiguity enhances the chamber's allure. A narrow recess near one corner draws your attention, partially concealed by moss and debris. Inside rests a tiny, chipped idol, a feline-human hybrid, its features worn but still evocative. You imagine the hands that placed it there, the ceremonies it witnessed, and the deliberate concealment intended to preserve its secrets. A faint draft flows from a crack in the wall, carrying earthy scents that mingle with the subtle, metallic tang of mineral deposits. Shadows flicker across the niche, creating a delicate dance of light and dark that seems alive under your gaze. A slender shaft of sunlight illuminates a section of the altar, revealing subtle traces of pigment and polished stone surfaces. Could this alignment have been intentional, marking celestial events, or guiding ritual practice. Researchers still argue about the purpose, and the uncertainty heightens the chamber's quiet tension, teasing curiosity. You drift closer, absorbing textures, observing shadows, inhaling the layered scents of moss, stone, and faint pigments. Time stretches and folds as seconds and centuries intermingle silently in this hidden space. Along the far wall, faint traces of erased glyphs suggest deliberately concealed knowledge. You trace their outlines with your invisible presence, imagining the stories they might have told, the rituals they may have instructed, and the secrets they preserved for select eyes only. The chamber's gentle hum, the distant drip of water, and the shifting light create a rhythmic, immersive environment that draws your attention deeper into the pyramid's mysteries. A small niche contains fragments of pottery etched with serpents, jaguars, and geometric designs worn smooth by centuries of ceremonial handling. You imagine the hands that placed them, the offerings made, and the hidden messages encoded in their subtle lines. The chamber's textures, scents, and shadowed carvings create a meditative atmosphere that encourages patient observation and quiet wonder. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps you've already drifted halfway into dreams. The narrow passage beyond the chamber beckons gently, its low archway partially obscured by moss and debris. Sunlight flickers across faint carvings along the threshold. Coiled serpents, crouching jaguars, abstract geometric motifs. Could this doorway conceal further chambers, hidden artifacts, or inscriptions deliberately erased from memory? You pause, savoring the textures, scents, and subtle energy, preparing to drift further into the pyramid's enduring mysteries. Every detail, the polished altar, moss-covered niches, faint pigments, and breathing carvings, reveals deliberate intention. The pyramid's energy flows quietly around you, rewarding careful observation and patience, drawing you into deeper layers of secrets waiting for an invisible witness to uncover. You pause at the threshold, letting anticipation coil gently in your senses, ready to step into the final chamber that promises a culmination of mysteries yet unseen. You step into the final chamber, a vast, vaulted space that immediately commands attention. The air is cooler here, carrying the deep, earthy scent of moss, damp stone, and faint incense long extinguished. Dust motes float lazily in the filtered sunlight, seeping through high cracks, shimmering like tiny suspended stars. Shadows hug the walls and ceiling, twisting gently as the light moves, creating the illusion that the chamber itself is breathing. You wouldn't believe the stories these walls could tell if they spoke. At the center rests a grand stone altar, larger and more intricate than any you've encountered so far. Its surface is polished smooth by centuries of touch, with faint traces of pigment clinging stubbornly to carved grooves. Fragments of pottery lie scattered around its base, etched with serpents, jaguars, and geometric patterns. Researchers still argue whether these were ceremonial offerings, symbolic markers, or tools for teaching hidden knowledge, but their presence imbues the space with palpable reverence. You drift closer, letting your invisible senses absorb every texture, sound, and scent. The walls are adorned with elaborate reliefs depicting jaguars, serpents, and abstract symbols, their lines precise yet worn. Sunlight filters in narrow shafts, casting fleeting flashes that make the carvings seem alive. Serpents appear to coil, jaguars crouch, and geometric forms pulse subtly. You wonder if these alignments served as guides for ritual, markers of celestial events, or messages intended only for select observers. Researchers still argue, yet the ambiguity enhances the chamber's quiet allure. Near the far wall, a deep recess is partially concealed by moss and shadow. Inside rests a large, cracked idol, a feline-human hybrid whose eyes, though chipped, catch the sunlight faintly. You imagine the hands that placed it centuries ago, the ceremonies performed, and the careful concealment meant to preserve its secrets. A faint draft rises from a narrow crack, carrying a subtle metallic tang, mixing with the earthy aroma of moss. The chamber hums gently, a resonance that seems almost alive, echoing softly against stone. A narrow slit in the ceiling allows a focused beam of sunlight to illuminate the altar, revealing faint pigments and polished stone surfaces. Could this alignment have been intentional, marking celestial events, guiding ritual, or signaling secret knowledge? Researchers still argue whether such features were functional, symbolic, or aesthetic, leaving the mystery unresolved. You drift closer, letting textures, shadows, and scents envelop your senses, time stretching and folding as seconds blend into centuries. Along the walls, traces of erased glyphs hint at deliberately concealed knowledge. You trace their outlines, imagining the stories and instructions once encoded, the rituals they guided, and the wisdom they preserved for select eyes. The hum of the chamber, the distant drip of water, and the shifting light create a rhythmic, immersive environment, coaxing quiet reflection and deepened curiosity. A final niche near the altar contains fragments of pottery etched with jaguars, serpents, and geometric designs, worn smooth from ceremonial handling. You imagine the hands that placed them, the offerings made, and the secrets encoded in their subtle details. The chamber's textures, scents, and shifting shadows create a meditative, almost hypnotic atmosphere that invites patient observation. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Or perhaps your eyes are already heavy, drifting between awareness and dreams. The narrow passage beyond beckons faintly, shadows stretching along carved figures, flickering in the slowly moving light. Polished surfaces catch your attention, moss creeps along cracks, and the soft hum of centuries resonates through the stone. You glide forward, drawn toward what may be the deepest, most hidden secrets of the pyramid, knowing that this final chamber holds the culmination of mysteries you have silently witnessed. Every detail, the grand altar, moss-covered niches, faint pigments, and breathing carvings, speaks of deliberate intention and enduring secrecy. The pyramid's energy flows quietly, rewarding careful observation and patience. You linger, absorbing the interplay of light, shadow, texture, and scent, aware that your journey through Uxmal's hidden layers has revealed only fragments of its enduring mysteries. The chamber holds its secrets still, patient and silent, a testament to the care of builders long gone, and the stories waiting for those who observe with quiet reverence. You hover in the quiet chamber, letting your senses drift slowly, absorbing the lingering echoes of centuries past. The air smells of damp moss and cold stone, with faint mineral tangs and remnants of incense, each breath carrying layers of memory. Dust motes float lazily in thin shafts of sunlight, glimmering like stars in a distant sky, suspended between now and then. Shadows stretch across walls and floors, shifting gently as the day moves on, creating a slow, hypnotic rhythm that soothes the mind. If you remember from earlier chambers, the jaguars crouched, serpents coiled, and abstract patterns pulsed under shifting light, as though the stone itself breathed, holding quiet stories for patient observers. Every carved groove, polished surface, and faded pigment holds layers of intention, rituals, and secrets, a silent record of human devotion and mystery. Time seems fluid here, seconds folding into centuries, minutes expanding into the whisper of eternity. The altars, niches, and scattered pottery fragments speak of ceremonies and careful concealment, inviting reflection. Each detail, the tactile coolness of stone, the earthy scent of moss, the soft hum resonating through chambers, the subtle flicker of sunlight, creates a gentle immersion, coaxing curiosity while slowly easing tension. You wonder what knowledge remains hidden, what was erased or intentionally concealed, and what stories these walls would whisper if they could. You drift through memory, retracing the journey through chambers, corridors, and hidden alcoves, letting the textures, scents, and soft light guide your thoughts. The pyramid holds its mysteries patiently, indifferent to time, yet generous to those who observe quietly. Your attention softens, curiosity fades into calm, and the interplay of light, shadow, and subtle sound lulls your mind toward rest. Now your breaths deepen, your eyelids grow heavier, and the pyramid's secrets settle around you like a comforting blanket. The chambers, altars, and hidden idols whisper softly into your awareness, a gentle invitation to dream. End of script. Sweet dreams.